think it's up to us, you with me.
For special effects artists, the summer movie releases make up a good portion of their bread and butter. And if you're lucky enough, you get to work on more than just one per summer. Such is the case with KNB Effects Group. Recently we dropped in to talk to co-founder Greg Nicotero about the work KNB did on the flicks Spy Kids and Ghosts of Mars.
Spy Kids was an interesting challenge because it was not a monster movie, which was a lot of fun for us because after a while, you know, guys in monster suits and blood gags and stuff gets, you know, a little tedious. When initially Robert and I talked about the movie, he had kind of said, well, you know, there's going to be a lot of digital effects, and I'm not really sure how I want to proceed with practical stuff. But I know that I'll need elements there to shoot. Whether they end up in the final movie or not, it still remains to be seen. One of the characters were these fingermen, which were basically, it was like characters made out of fingers and thumbs.
The Thumb henchmen that KNB were called on to create were actually designed by director Robert Rodriguez when he was a teenager.
Initially, when he came out here with the drawings, a lot of them were his sketches. There were ideas that he had done. He hired a sculptor named Cleet Shields, and Cleet fleshed out a lot of it, and then they took the maquettes and they plopped them down and said, this is what we want them to look like. For us, of course, there was a bit of a transformation from maquette to putting it on the actual human being, which is always something that people don't take into consideration. They go, oh, it should look exactly like this. Robert was always very specific. He would send me a photo of the maquette, and I would put a photo of the sculpture right next to it and email it to him. And then he would sit there and say, match the maquette exactly. The lips need to be this distance apart, the eyes need to be that distance apart. And I would have to say, Robert, but there's a human being inside ours. There's not a human being inside the maquette. So we do need to make certain liberties. We had mocked up a rough version of one of the costumes to show Robert, and after the first test, he went, oh, that's great. Yeah, absolutely. We should make like 6 of these. But ultimately, we realized that Robert was really using them for reference. The way that the CGI characters would be able to move the joints and move their head side to side, and the way that they were able to walk was a lot different than a guy in a costume could ever walk. So what we did was, on set, we shot all the sequences with our guys in the costumes, with the understanding that then Robert would use those as a guide for the animators. The way that they were able to use the thumb suits for reference was they would shoot the sequence with the performers in the suits walking around the set, doing whatever action is that they were supposed to do. And after they got it to Robert's satisfaction, then they would just shoot a clean plate, so that the animators would use the reference, not only the lighting reference, but also the movement. You don't want to have the actors acting to a scene with a cardboard cutout or something. It just doesn't work. The action is laid out, it's shot, it's directed on the set in the correct lighting situation with the director's input right there.
What the devil are these fingermen? Oh, they're called thumbs. Very capable robots. But all thumbs, useless.
One sequence that KNB worked on involved an animatronic shark. It was cut from the original release, but restored for the special edition theatrical release of the film.
We went through a lot of time designing what the sharks would look like. They didn't want them to be threatening, they didn't want them to be scary looking. They were supposed to be more wondrous than anything else. It wasn't just, go make me a real shark. These were fantasy sharks that Robert had created. So we spent a lot of time playing with the idea of shortening the tail and making the shark a little pudgier so he looked like an infant shark. Then it was like, now he looks like a tuna fish instead of a shark. So we did a lot of work with the design maquette in terms of the size of the fins, and ultimately what we ended up doing was creating 2 puppets. One that was a complete silicone shark with not only a blinking eye, but expanding gills, opening and closing jaw, and a tail mechanism. The gag in the movie is once the plane crashes, they jump out of the plane, they land in the water, and they have to swim through this cave of sleeping sharks to get to Floop's castle. So as they're swimming through, one of the sharks wakes up, and you're supposed to get the impression that all the sharks suddenly are awakened by the presence of the 2 kids. So one of the jokes Robert always made was, I know sharks don't blink. I know that they won't blink like this, but what he wanted was like suddenly the shark was alarmed and woke up. So we had a mechanism in the eye so that the eyeball would open and close. We shot all this stuff all green screen. Even the kids swimming was like Fantastic Voyage, where they were on harnesses and they were doing this, swimming around. And when we got to putting the movie together, Robert just said, I think we're going to save that scene for the sequel. I said, really? Why? He goes, well, he said there's a lot of visual effects shots in that one particular sequence, and maybe if the movie does really well, we'll throw a special edition out and we'll throw that scene back in. And ultimately, that's what happened.
Some of Spy Kids' more interesting makeups were for characters called Fooglies. Any agent unlucky enough to get caught in the villain's castle was turned into one of these Play-Doh-y creatures.
One of the design things that we went back and forth on also was whether they were supposed to be frozen in that expression or whether they would be able to talk and move their faces around. Originally, we had designed them as makeups so that you could see their mouths moving, you could see the actors' facial movements coming through the prosthetic. And when we did the first test, Robert said, no, they should be frozen in this expression. If you imagine that Floop took a likeness of their faces and sculpted it into one of the Foogly characters, it would be frozen in that expression. It made it a lot easier for us because then we ended up just creating foam masks that we could glue down around the eyes and color the actor's eyes instead of having to worry about a multi-piece prosthetic makeup that would take several hours, like 2 hours a day or an hour and a half a day. It was really rewarding to see that movie do so well because it got a good heart to it, and that's what's nice. And aside from doing a lot of prop stuff, we built the jetpacks and we had radio-controlled jetpacks and all that kind of stuff. So we were on set every day in Austin, either maintaining the costumes or some of the props we did, or the makeups, or the sharks. Or it was ultimately a pretty busy show for us when we were down in Austin, Texas, on set every single day.
Okay, so Spy Kids was good family fun, but what about the movie buff who likes his entertainment a bit gorier? Greg talked about KNB's contribution to John Carpenter's Ghosts of Mars.
When this film came up, it was a lot different than John's other movies in regards to the fact that he really relied heavily on his crew people to pull off stuff that hadn't been done before. The idea was that once you become possessed by a Martian ghost, your goal is to become as formidable as possible. So they would pierce themselves with pieces of metal, or they would carve symbols into their faces, or they would do war paint, or all these different kinds of ideas. We wanted it to be different. We wanted it to be fresh. So we wanted a fresh approach. We contacted a fantasy illustrator named Brom, and we said, we have this movie going, and we think that it's right up your alley. And would you be interested in doing some conceptual artwork and design stuff for us? And he said, yeah, I'd love to. That'd be, He said, most of the time people just rip my stuff off without ever giving me credit. Now you're going to actually pay me and put my name. I said, yeah, absolutely. I think that it would lend a lot to the film. So we hired Brom, and he did a bunch of drawings and a bunch of designs for us, as well as designing The Martian. And they were so happy with his artwork that all of a sudden the costume department had a copy of his book, and the props people had a copy. I mean, suddenly everybody was buying Brom's book and using his visual style as reference. Initially, the deal was to come up with the look of the pierced warriors. We had to do probably 100, 125 characters a night. So we did 75 background masks. Then we had our 12 to 20 hero makeups, and then we had some mid-ground versions as well. We created all the masks here, and we had them all look a little bit different. Some of them had shaved heads, some of them had skulls painted on the faces, and they were all these metal piercings. I mean, the nice thing about it was that it allowed us to turn an entire crowd of people quickly into a rogue gang of possessed people. So once we were on location, there were 6 makeup artists, and we had to literally crank them out. We would go in at 4 in the afternoon and do makeup until 9 o'clock at night, and then they would all go to set, and they'd shoot with them, and then we'd go to lunch, and then we'd wrap at 6:30 in the morning, and we'd have to clean everybody up, and we'd get out of there about 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning. So we were working 18 hours a day, every day for 6 weeks, and it was really grueling. It was really a challenging movie, and a lot of times too, when you're doing a crowd scene, you have 125 extras, and you have 20 to 25 that are hero ones. you want to put your 25 up front. But if they have 4 cameras going on, there's a camera here, a camera here, a camera here, a camera here. Obviously, these 2 cameras that are shooting into the crowd, they're going to be seeing the ones that are supposed to be the furthest away. So I'd have Sandy King or John Carpenter come up and go, "Guy, I can see the mask." And I said, "I know, John, but we got our 20 heroes up front. We had to constantly look through the lens to see what we were seeing and switch characters out." My feeling was, less is more. We don't want to see the faces of all these things because that's what makes it scary. That's what made Michael Myers scary. That's what made, you know, the fog. That's what made those faceless characters scary, is that you never see them. And then we had Big Daddy Mars, who was our sort of lead Martian villain, who was played by Richard Citrome. And he ended up looking more like a sort of a twisted Marilyn Manson. I mean, none of us really thought about it until the first day we got on set. And we built his entire costume as well. John wanted his chest to be a little more massive, so we sculpted a big chest prosthetic, which we incorporated into the costumes.
Tenants!
Ironically enough, there weren't a lot of gore gags. Most of the action, John really wanted it to be quick. He didn't want to have to stop and cut to an insert of a head being chopped off or something like that, which I tend to agree with. We ended up designing a lot of the visual effects shots where there's always movement, and it's always wide shots. One of the characters named Descanso, who gets killed in the film, he's dragging one of the other survivors along, and one of these weapons called a razor disc that the Martians throw comes through and chops his arm off. And originally John said, "Oh, we'll just do it digitally." I said, "John, let's make a fake arm, we'll separate it here, we'll put a squib, a blood bag in there and detonate it so that the actor can not only see the blood spray but react to it." Same with when one of the other characters gets killed. She's running and she ducks, and when she stands back up, boom, her head comes off. So we made a fake head of her on a pole, and we filled the neck area with blood bags. We shot her doing her whole action. Then we took her away, we put the head out in the same general area, and they took the element of the head and digitally removed the actress's head and put the element of the phony head that we had done into the shot. So you see her duck, she stands up, and the head flies off and rolls. In that regard, I was happy that a lot of the visual effects became a marriage between prosthetics and computer stuff, which I always feel has much more of an impact than just a completely rendered character or a fake head for that matter.
Man, that sounds pretty gory. But how much blood is too much?
When you're doing blood gags, one of the most difficult aspects is timing the blood right. One of the first gags we did in the movie is there's a character who's in one of these Land Rovers, and our heroes come across him, and he sits up, and you can tell that he's got this crazy look in his eye, and he pulls a knife up and whoosh, cuts his throat. I went to John the night before, and I said, "Well, how bloody do you want this? How do you want to see this? Do you want it a slow drip? Do you want a spurt? He said, "I'm not sure. Why don't you show me what you got?" So we went up to the trailer with the actor, and we had a dulled knife from props, and we put the prosthetic on him with the blood bag in the back, and then we did a couple tests. And the first test, of course, the blood was a little too thick, and you could be standing 5 feet away with a syringe or a blood pump or whatever. And if it's too thick, it's not going to go through the little tubing, and then nothing comes out. So we ultimately had to sort of finesse that a little bit. One time we put a little too much water in it, one time we put not enough water in it. Once we got a good spray and something that we liked, we then did the final version where we actually filled the slit in so that the slit was not apparent, initially in the opening of the shot. And then as he brings the fake knife across and we spray the blood would actually pump through the material that we had closed the slit throat with, and it would look like the cut appears.
Okay, so that gives new meaning to the term blood test. If you're interested in hearing more about KNB's history and other projects they've worked on, be sure and check out part 2 of Greg's interview on issue 5 of Movie Effects.